Greetings, friends. This is Janet ESP, and I just wanted to put out a short video discussing a topic that I think is important. It also relates to my book project, and I was actually working on this part in my book, and I'm like, hey, I could do a short little video of that right now, because I want to be putting out more content. I have so much content that's going to come out, as soon as this book gets published. So please stay tuned for that. And in case you're wondering, the book I'm talking about it's going to be an essay on natural law and then a critique on Stefan Molyneux, Jordan Peterson, and Ken Wilber. And the topic I want to discuss today focuses more on Jordan Peterson and Stefan Molyneux in terms of being two thinkers from the intellectual dark web. And I know Michael Black has spoken about this. I think he's the only one that I found that have spoken about this that has knowledge of natural law.
Another thing I'd like to raise as well, because this has been on my mind for months, I've privately spoken about it with a few people, when it comes to the intellectual dark web, right, is that these are the folks that have been floating the idea that IQ is the be-all and end-all of human consciousness almost, or human achievement. To put it another way, these guys are social Darwinists. Okay, they're social Darwinists. That's the reason why they place such a high emphasis on IQ. And folks that purport to be on the right, even in the circles of the alt-right, seize upon the idea of IQ. And there's something I'd like to warn you all about very quickly as we talk here. And that is, see, the moment you hear anyone harping on about IQ, be very, very careful, because those folks are most likely, and I don't use this term lightly at all, but those folks are bound to be controlled opposition. Let me tell you.
So I would definitely check this out, but just so you know, Michael Black has removed some of his videos temporarily, but he will be getting them back up soon. And the intellectual dark web has to do with this desire to go against the current cultural narrative, which is this leftist socialist, postmodern feminist propaganda, which of course, the social engineers, they always want to fuel one side real heavily, and then there's like this natural opposition and reaction that occurs with it, because they also want to follow the natural rhythms and cycles of nature. And so when that natural opposition starts to happen, then they co-opt that too, or thinkers tend to fall into the habits of the past, like with modern empiricism. And so what we're seeing right now is this rise of the new empiricists, but there's always this rise of empiricism when socialism or right brain imbalance kind of goes to the extreme, because what we see with the humanities is this emphasis of feelings only, and then we have this natural opposition that emerges from that with thinkers like Molyneux and Peterson, which want to be based on objective facts. And then you have that worldview of scientism. And in a sense, you have the postmodern versus the scientism worldview, which is just another dialectic, the masculine left brain imbalance of scientism, the right brain imbalance of postmodernism.
What we have here is a set of nested taboos. Human intelligence itself is a taboo topic. People don't want to hear that intelligence is a real thing, and that some people have more of it than others. They don't want to hear that IQ tests really measure it. They don't want to hear that differences in IQ matter, because they're highly predictive of differential success in life. And not just for things like educational attainment and wealth, but for things like out-of-wedlock birth and mortality. People don't want to hear that a person's intelligence is in large measure due to his or her genes, and that there seems to be very little we can do environmentally to increase a person's intelligence, even in childhood. It's not that the environment doesn't matter, but genes appear to be 50 to 80% of the story. People don't want to hear this. And they certainly don't want to hear that average IQ differs across races and ethnic groups.
These intellectuals, they want to go against this political correctness of the postmodern socialist, humanities. And all of that, you can look into the Tavistock Institute of Human Relations and the Frankfurt School of the Critical Theorist, and even the CIA-funded French postmodernism. So we can see that, there's this socialist, agenda towards a one world government. It's always about more government control. Like, that is the premise of government, is to keep gaining more power and more control over the people until there's a collapse, and then it co-opts the collapse, and then the cycle repeats. So right now we're in this phase of socialism that's verging on, this the edge of censorship in, prohibiting certain speech or banning certain words and all of that type of thing. And so with these dark intellectuals, I want to call them actually dark intellectuals because we're going to talk about the worldview, which is a Darwinian worldview, which is actually a very dark, poisoned worldview on human nature and society. So these dark intellectuals, they want to oppose this political correctness, feelings only, type of very restrictive environment, and where everyone gets to be in their safe space or something like that. And so they want to bring out, this information of this new scientific research that has showed a relationship between IQ and race, like this is some deep occulted information that they want to be the ones to expose, and then also hide behind science and, make it seem like these are just objective facts and, we're going to make you uncomfortable with the objective facts. And, they ultimately end up feeding the political dialectic, because on the left, recall that I'm going to be talking about the left and right here. But on the left, you have this multiculturalism and this desire to eradicate all differences between all human beings and make everyone the same, And the problem with them is that they want to do that in terms of destroying logic and destroying logical categories, so that no differences exist. Now, that's utterly absurd, So we understand why this other side, the left brain, individuals like Molyneux come out and now they want to be, extremely strict in their logical categories, down to the empirical numerical values of IQ, and statistics and all of that. And so they want to, combat, the right brain imbalance with that. But you don't resolve one extreme with another extreme. What this channel is about is holistic consciousness, is seeing the partial truth in both, eliminating the baggage in both, and realizing that, truth is above all that. So we can consider Stefan Molyneux, Jordan Peterson, and even Sam Harris and the other materialists like Richard Dawkins, to be, these empiricists, that want to use statistics to show us, what's really going on in reality. And at this point, I am going to mention that it's important to include what postmodernism got right. And what they got right is they recognized that there is a cultural narrative behind how we perceive reality and behind our methodologies for discerning reality and even our conclusions and our interpretations. And this is something that the empiricists don't really look at. The empiricists don't look at worldviews. They just look at the numbers themselves, thinking that within the numbers you can find the causal factors and you can find the relationships, but you can only determine causal factors and relationships through metaphysics. In the empiricists, they're anti-metaphysical. So the empiricists confuse the conditions with metaphysics. They think anything that arises in the conditions, such as the social hierarchy, to be based on the evolutionary principle of necessity for survival. And that this, and we're going to get into the social hierarchy later, but they believe the social hierarchy to be embedded in the way that the world has to work, rather than seeing it as a product of consciousness and free will, with the polarity of good and evil, in which the social hierarchy is actually a manifestation of evil. Their own worldview is determining how they're perceiving reality and what kind of conclusions that they're drawing. So we do want to look at how the Western worldview biases, this supposed objective test on intelligence, and and how all these statistical facts, are how we arrange them to make meaning. There is a Western cultural narrative behind it, and I think it's important for us to look at the origin of the IQ test itself. And the origin is with the eugenicists after Darwin. So Charles Darwin and the Darwinists, come up with evolutionary theory, survival of the fittest, might makes right, and then Francis Galton, Darwin's cousin, comes up with eugenics, and they're like, well, if, man is evolving and we're directing our own evolution, because recall, there's no metaphysics in Darwinism. There's no aligning to the objective rule of the universe and its law of evolution. It's about creating what you think evolution should be, because Darwinism is a materialist paradigm that's elevates man's intelligence as the highest intelligence, because we've evolved for so many years that we're the peak of intelligence, which is completely ridiculous. And so man gets to determine what evolution is. And this is the underlying thesis for the social engineers. And they want to dictate what evolution is. So in order to dictate what evolution is, then you need to discern between, superior man and inferior man. And, we're getting into the fact that elitism is an essential tenet of Darwinism, because now we have man evolving from material, and then we have the higher man versus the lower man. And, the superior man should rule the lower man. So, and that's essentially the tenet of government. So what I'm trying to do here is I'm trying to map out how all the false ideologies interconnect, just like true metaphysics interconnects. But true metaphysics interconnects in a harmonious truth, while these false ideologies, they mutually support error. So there's a difference. Okay, so evolutionary theory, such as Darwinism, is based in man's creation, has a relative notion of what evolution means, like technological political superiority. The methodology is through social engineering. It exalts this plane as ultimate reality, and the endpoint is transhumanism of the technocracy. Now, real evolution, on the other hand, which is natural law, is based in nature, objective reality. Evolution is independent to man's perception, intrinsic to the structure of the cosmos. The path of evolution is to align to natural law in corresponding degrees of greater and lesser. There are infinite levels above this plane of reality, and the endpoint is the return to the infinite all, the alpha and the omega, ultimate reality. Okay, so here we have an article from New American called Eugenics or Scientific Racism in American Education, written by Sam Blumenfield. He mentions Sir Francis Galton, 1822 to 1911, cousin of Charles Darwin, who concluded that ways had to be found to encourage the fertility of the superior stock and to discourage the fertility of the inferior stock. In order to determine which individuals had superior traits, Galton created an anthropometric laboratory in 1884 for the measurement of man, with the hope that by means of test he could single out those individuals who should survive. However, Galton realized that physical measurements alone were not enough to determine the criteria he needed. He began searching for ways to investigate psychological differences. So then Galton met James McKeen Cattell, who you should definitely look up, and he had just completed 2 years in the laboratories of William Wundt, and William Wundt is considered the father of modern psychology, so we're already seeing a eugenics basis in modern psychology. So he was from Germany. So Cattell spent 2 years working in Galton's lab, and then he used experimental techniques to investigate the mental differences among normal individuals. And he coined the term a mental test. So Cattell used Galton's framework of physical and physiological anthropometry, in which to conduct his experiments on individual differences. And then Cattell worked with John Dewey. So John Dewey is another person you got to research, who's known as the father of progressive education. All of these people are pretty networked, and they're all social Darwinists. L. Thorndike was Cattell's star pupil. You got to look up him as well. He was a behaviorist and, into operant conditioning. They're all into social conditioning of school children. And so anyways, yeah, this is all social engineering. Thorndike writes a book on animal intelligence, and these social Darwinists, they think of humans as animals, and they think of them as the superior animal, and so it's all about controlling through behaviorism. Okay, so down here it talks about how Thorndike, believed that blacks were inferior and had to be treated differently in education. And so we're seeing how this is like a self-fulfilling prophecy where when you think that someone's lesser than you and you have a test to measure that, then your test is going to verify that. But this says nothing about objective reality. It's all in the agenda of the tester and how the test is created. Okay, so here we have socialist or collectivist John Dewey saying, quote, "I believe that the individual who is to be educated is a social individual, and that society is an organic union of individuals. Examinations are of use only so far as they test the child's fitness for social life and reveal the place in which he can be most service and where he can receive the most help." And so we can see the IQ test in the context of seeing where a person's position is, in this hierarchy. The hierarchy of masters and slaves. It's all about functionality and what you can derive from the human slave. If you have a high IQ, then you should be working on the atomic bomb, because all high IQs are going to be exploited for technological destruction or surveillance or the destruction of freedom. Whether it's the destruction of freedom or destruction of life, everything that the control system creates is geared towards evil. Here it says eugenics conference were held in the United States to spread the new scientific spirit of racism within academia. Stanley Hall, who had become the president of this university, he encouraged his students to try to develop this test for mental capacity, and then one of his students devised a mental test that was to become most famous of them all, measuring the IQ, the intelligent quotient. So it's the ratio of a child's mental age to his chronological age multiplied by 100. Terman, the creator of this test, believed that intelligence was a matter of genetic inheritance and that genetic superiority could be therefore determined by the test. We see that the test is already created with implicit biases in it, that what it's testing for is hereditary. I would like to reiterate that this is not true science, that there was never a hypothesis that perhaps hereditary is the reason, the determining factor behind any types of differences between people. But that was never a hypothesis. It was taken as a given. It was already an implicit tenet in the theory of IQ that hereditary is the basis for difference. So then we see how Hitler's eugenicist sterilization laws were just totally insane and just really showed the endpoint of the whole theory. But then it got subverted through Project Paperclip and brought into America secretly. And basically eugenics was changed into different names like social biology and transhumanism. So these ideas gained popularity in the late 20th century with the book The Bell Curve, Intelligence and Class Structure in American Life, published in 1994. And Charles Murray is the main author to publicize the information of this, which is nothing different than Francis Galton. In fact, the book begins with Francis Galton and how he defines intelligence. And then the book talks about the emergence of a cognitive elite, and these authors want to, give a rationalization for the social engineering of humanity that, changes need to be made based on this IQ information. So, this gives the control system just more power to implement itself over humanity. So in order to determine the difference between superior and inferior man, we need some kind of empirical test to discern that. And this is why Darwinists they're empiricists, because they're just basically looking at reality. So reality is just composed of objects, which can be reduced to numerical values. The metaphysician Ray Guénon called this the reign of quantification, where it's just measurable reality is all that exists, which is a completely false assertion because consciousness exists and consciousness is not measurable. And guess what? Consciousness is what's creating reality. So that is another problem with the empiricist worldview, is that it only looks at the realm of the facts and it can't lift up the curtain and look behind it to see what is driving reality creation, which are the archetypes, care in your mind, your worldview, your outlook, all of that is creating reality, but you can't see those things, but you can see the reality it's creating. So the empiricists are always going to be in the realm of facts, in which they create their statistical analysis, they're using the effects of the statistical analysis to deduce the cause, which you cannot. And so there's that saying, correlation does not mean causation. And that is the main error of statistics. You can find any two variables in their relationships, but you're never going to know the nature of that relationship through the statistical analysis itself. And this is why it's important to have metaphysical principles and understanding the objective difference between right and wrong, good and evil, and also how the social engineering is playing a part in our world, to be able to make meaning as to what is happening and why we're having certain phenomenon happen. We have to really look into the eugenicist worldview to understand how they are interpreting what intelligence is and what it means. Because to them, they look at, they're very left brain imbalanced, and you notice this with people in high positions of power, they end up being psychopathic, they don't have empathy, they don't have morality, they don't have love, because those are not their values. And here we see how the IQ test actually reflects the false Western values of money and status.
Yes!
Oh, money is everything! Money is everything! I mean, that is essentially what Western Enlightenment has been about. And that's why we have so much criticism of the Enlightenment and so much criticism of capitalism and all that, because we have this total, this false individualistic spirit. It's not the individualistic spirit of sovereignty, of self-governship, self-government. It's the individualism of ego, and just seeing how much you can acquire, seeing how much you can dominate, seeing how much you can get ahead and be on top, dog eat dog, and it's just like the pursuit of excellence is like this, it's just turned into this crazy competition, and, for all ego satisfaction. It's a game of nothing, really, because all of that means nothing. What are the true values in reality? The true values are love, are evolving consciousness, goodness, truth, freedom. These virtues. That is what is good. But those aren't the virtues of Western culture, and that is kind of the myth of the Enlightenment. Here, Stefan Molyneux reveals that he understands that we live on a human farm.
This human farming has been the most profitable and destructive occupation throughout history, and it is now reaching its destructive climax. Human society cannot be rationally understood until it is seen for what it is: a series of farms where human farmers own human livestock. Some people get confused because governments provide healthcare and water and education and roads, and thus imagine that there is some benevolence at work. Nothing could be further from the reality. Farmers provide healthcare and irrigation and training to their livestock. Some people get confused because we are allowed certain liberties and thus imagine that our governments protect our freedoms. But farmers plant their crops a certain distance apart to increase their yields and will allow certain animals larger stalls or fields if it means they will produce more meat and milk. In your country, your tax farm, your farmer grants you certain freedoms, not because he cares about your liberties, but because he wants to increase his profits. Are you beginning to see the nature of the cage you were born into?
The Western worldview has this obsession with the social hierarchy and finding their own intrinsic value from their placement, their social positioning on this hierarchy. And the hierarchy is a completely fabricated construct. The postmodernists understood that some of our concepts are socially constructed, and the social hierarchy is one of them. And its social hierarchy is based in the Darwinian worldview, which wants to divide man from man and have the elitist, against the rest of humanity, the dumb shit humanity. And, this is the paradigm of master slaves. So essentially the IQ test it's measuring your left brain. It's measuring how fast you process information, how well you are at deducing facts in problem solving. And, it's kind of testing to see how efficient you are as a human mind machine. It's really isolating, the meaning of mind, because mind is no longer your worldview and how you are perceiving reality. It's how fast you can process information. It's how accurate you can recall. It's your memory. It's all of those things. And all of those traits make a really, really good slave, you see.
How many digits can you keep in your head simultaneously without dropping one? That's it.
God, it's unbelievable. It's pretty straightforward. And then it's this viciously powerful predictor of long-term life success, probably a prediction of around 0.5.
The control system in Elitist 1 are high-functioning slaves. So in a sense, when we call the control system the patriarchy, or when the left postmodernist does, the partial truth of that is that it is a left brain system. Like, that's how it measures people, is through your left brain. But at the same time, it's an imbalance on both sides, because while you're working to advance in the system, you are completely blind to the global holistic perspective of what exactly is going on. You're essentially chasing something that doesn't exist, and that's not for your evolutionary benefit. You're not cultivating the real values of moral knowledge and love and goodness. And so the feminine aspects are pathologically being expressed as self-loathing and internal slavery, which manifests as external slavery. I mean, just by virtue of emphasizing the left brain, you're already in that master-slave dynamic, because, any imbalance in consciousness is going to create, if you're too left brain, you're going to be about dominance. And that's why we see people like Molyneux kind of falling into the traps of sounding sometimes misogynistic, but also sounding racist, when he's not any of those things. He's trapped in that left brain ideology where discernment has become this elitist judgment, and now it's about white pride and how, white people have higher IQs than immigrants. Very naive of so-called scientists to just take the IQ test for face value, but at the same time, they are in that worldview where any test done with numbers is kind of certified already to them, because it has that scientific appearance. But when you really analyze, like, what exactly are we testing, and we're not testing with the IQ, we're not testing holistic consciousness, we're not testing the psychological depth of an individual, we're not testing their moral consciousness, how they interpret information, how they understand archetypes. And understanding archetypes is a very, very important It's a very, very important endeavor, in the evolution of our consciousness. And that's the one thing that's being destroyed by empiricists, is the whole notion of archetypes altogether, which is why Jordan Peterson's work, on the other hand, can open up the idea of archetypes, to people like Molyneux. Like Molyneux, there's no archetypes with him. But for the most part, you can't determine someone's value extrinsically, through what they produce, through what they make. Here we see the Western biases. It's all about achievement. It's all about, the concrete, tangible things that you've done for humanity or that you've done for your company. It's not even for humanity, because humanitarianism is turned into corporatocracy anyways, so it's like how much you can do for the company and how much status you have and how much prestige you have. But all of that is so fake, because it's all based on the social hierarchy and its false values. It's not about the values of love. It's not how much you've loved. It's not how, you know what I mean? Like, how do you measure that? How much you've loved in your life? So, that's why, you can't reduce consciousness to a numerical value. It's just ridiculous. Every individuated soul will return to the infinite all. We all have infinite value. So IQ essentially determines what level of slave you can be for the human farmers. And unfortunately, this ego payoff for individuals with high IQ, can prevent them from ever, attaining holistic intelligence to see that they're just a high-level slave.
I'm going to give a very, very brief history of what it is, and for those who don't know where the science is. And I'm not a scientist, so people verify all of this. I've got a whole list of interviews with subject matter experts on the show about this topic. So listen to the experts. This is my amateur summation, just for those who want to know. So the U.S. Army, for over 100 years, has been giving more or less IQ tests to people to figure out whether they're sort of officer material or, grunt material, so to speak. And what they
Notice that the first thing that Molyneux talks about in terms of the history of IQ is that the U.S. Army uses it to determine the level, the social hierarchy. What's a little disheartening about this is that Molyneux is somebody who understands that we live in a slavery system and understands that the army and the military is a monopoly on violence, which is immoral. But he can't see that the IQ test is how the human farmers differentiate between the human stock, as a means towards their end. Now, the thing with race in IQ is that, According to these empiricists and these scientists who've done, the statistical research, is that they've discovered that the differences in IQ within a race is actually greater than between the races. So already right there, that makes the entire subject ridiculous to even discuss, because what we're seeing here is that the individual differences are always greater. So in looking at the condition of Black people, they have been enslaved longer than they have been free. And so if we have this whole Western civilization built on Blacks being slaves for most of the time, then, that stays in our worldview. And so it should be no surprise that Blacks would be statistically at the lower end of the social hierarchy still, because that's a lot of false beliefs perpetuated towards them, and the problem, though, is that, the left wants to eradicate racism and can see that problem, but it never eradicates the social hierarchy. So it still basically enforces the whole illusory structure of masters and slaves. Because even though we abolish slavery, we're still all enslaved by this system of greed, profit, self-interest, ego, etc. What the left wants to do is it wants to manipulate the social hierarchy to be in favor for minorities through minority privilege and through equal opportunity, equal outcomes. But it doesn't challenge the true nature of the social hierarchy, which it pretends that it does. And this is why, the opposite side, the white males react and they're like, white privilege? What the fuck is that? We don't have privilege. We're slaves too. So, this is another expression of the dialectic. And at least Sam Harris, to some degree, is the most truest of the empiricists of the three, because he actually claims the universe is deterministic and that we have no free will, which is completely ludicrous. But if you're going to take a materialist worldview, that is the only logical worldview that you can have, is that it is deterministic. So these guys are basing, everything off of hereditary. It's not about consciousness. It's not about the negative conditions that we've created ourselves. It's not about free will, and that type of worldview is what makes these intellectuals part of the dark web. It's dark because you cannot change anything if you believe that you're just a product of your genes. And it's actually very false to think that, because even the new sciences of today of epigenetic reveal that consciousness controls the genes and it's not the other way around. This is the main thing that all statistical analysis will not have, as part of the analysis, is consciousness, because it's not something that you can measure. And of course, it's not going to have the consciousness of the people doing the study. How are you going to see that unless you understand, metaphysical principles and archetypes, and seeing how the feminine right brain imbalance, is being pitted against the masculine left brain imbalance. These are archetypes. And if you don't understand these archetypes, then you're not going to be understand this political dialectic that's being imposed on us to keep us into dualistic consciousness, to prevent us from evolving our consciousness. So what these intellectuals of the dark web, what they're doing is they're basically reinforcing the conquer and divide strategy, because it's all about getting people to divide amongst each other, and because, the left postmodernists are, just completely denying the existence of objective facts, then we have the dark intellectuals, wanting to be like, oh, well, no, actually there are objective differences between the races and their IQs are different, blah, 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 blah. And it's just like we can understand how that reaction was created, but it was a planned reaction. I mean, that's what the social engineers want, because now the right of the empiricists, now they're actually reinforcing that there are racial differences, and then this is going to create more racism and more hypersensitivity to racism, and it's all just feeding into this, like I said, the divide and conquer. The controllers, they just want us to be against each other, so it takes the spotlight off of them, because they're our common enemy, and if we're fighting amongst ourselves, we're never going to focus on the real enemy. The intellectuals of the dark web are also reinforcing identity politics, where everyone is so identified with superficial things like their race and their ethnicity and their culture, and they're just super embedded in it, and this is what prevents humanity from becoming awake into universal knowledge, the universal knowledge that unites us all. And just because we've chosen to experience a particular aspect of reality through a particular bodysuit, and ethnicity and all that, like we're just choosing that for our experience. That isn't who we are, so understanding the true self is essential in the rise of consciousness, and that we are consciousness. We're not our bodies. This body identification, also keeps us stuck in the matrix too, in which we can be controlled. Part of the reason why these intellectual dark web people, elevate IQ so highly is because they're humanists. There is no God, there is no origin of natural law or divine origin of all creation. And so, the highest IQ is to them God, because that's the highest intelligence that exists in the universe to them, because they're completely dissociated from the right side brain and the holistic perception of holistic reason, in that no, intelligence is in creation, like there's a greater intelligence that created us. We have to also consider that there's infinite amount of errors within statistical analysis, like the errors of population sample of questionnaires. You don't even know if what you're testing is measuring what you want to test, and there's tons of complications when you just look at it from an empiricist, rational perspective. But besides that, giving this the benefit of the doubt, we can observe, with our own senses that there are certain differences. But the thing is that you can't say that those differences are caused by race itself. And this is another thing that these statistical tests want to obfuscate from view, is life conditions. You see, we live in an immoral society, and most people are oblivious to it because they're living they're the fish in the water. They can't see the water. It is the matrix, and until you start to see the matrix, you're not going to understand how societal problems and issues arise. You're not going to understand those causal factors, which humanity is in a very unnatural, unhealthy state. So there's going to be all sorts of problems stemming from that. And then on top of that, by understanding that consciousness is primary and that consciousness creates reality, the law of mind, we understand how our own worldview of ourself creates ourselves. So if a certain population, a certain race of people, they believe themselves to be a certain way, they will manifest that way. If we, that's why it all comes down to what we think. And that's why I don't think we should be thinking about IQ and race. I think that is the most dumbest thing to spend our time on, but I'm spending time on it because I've just been seeing so much stuff on the web about it that I just was like, I have to say something. This is why we need to toss empiricism to the side and postmodernism to the side for metaphysics, which requires holistic consciousness, as to unite science and spirituality. What we need to work on is evolving our consciousness so that we see ourselves in a healthy, good way. We have to leave behind this self-loathing paradigm, because all the divide and conquer stuff, it just feeds on our own self-loathing, our own hatred, of ourselves, because we have unresolved mommy-daddy issues. We feel inadequate. We feel insecure. Like, we have to resolve all those issues and come to love and realize that love is the expansion of consciousness. That is the correct movement of evolution. Like, we need to put our energy into the cause. We need to put our energy into coming from a correct worldview, and not this Darwinian competitive worldview that believes that there's a scarce amount of resources and we all need to be fighting in it, because that's all that the social hierarchy is based on. It's based on false scarcity, that we're all competing for resources. Hello, the planet is incredibly abundant and has plenty. Our planet has plenty of stuff, okay, for all of us. We're all fine. We can all survive here, but it's because we have the worldview that survival is scarce and we gotta fight for survival. That's what's creating this drama and, all of this pain and suffering. And now we are based on a scarce resource called money, which the bankers own. So it's like we've manifested this horrible conditions of reality, and then we expect to actually gather scientific data about that reality and then understand it from just the data itself. It's like, no, It's like you got to come from a correct worldview, and you got to understand the dynamics of reality creation and what's really happening in the world. So please go to whatonearthishappening.com. Please check out Mark Passio's whatonearthishappening.com. I just thought it'd be funny to mention the fact that every time I say the right and the left, like I was actually thinking that this was my right and my left, because I still get this confused because on the IQ test I completely flunked spatial intelligence, but that actually worked in your favor because of the mirroring. So maybe that's why I get my rights and lefts confused, is because I'm trying to communicate to people better. I also recognize, and I think this is what's causing me some confusion between the left and right, is that I'm correlating the left brain with the right and the right brain with the left. So that could be a little confusing too. So just be sure that you understand, the differences between the feminine and masculine of the brain, of mental gender, and then also the political spectrum, and which is basically your worldview bias towards either the masculine or the feminine. Okay, so I'm sorry that this video ended up being so long. This is another day, obviously. I was playing with makeup, so I apologize if that offends you. Just kidding. But I wanted to tell a personal story about this teacher at the junior college I went to in Moore Park, and this teacher's name was Dr. Ogden, and he was a hardcore materialist, and he taught my older brother biology, and it had such an impact on my older brother that he went into that field. And sadly, my older brother is still caught in the materialist paradigm. And so Dr. Ogden, because of his very intense perspective and the fact that he was also very intelligent, was pretty famous around the college campus, and everyone was like, have you taken his class yet? And if you did, and if you were pushing him for his worldview and his truth and all of that, then he would basically, take you in his quarters and, bust out with his Bible, which was the bell curve. So, this bell curve book, is a religion of science. And to me, it's like a way for people to explain why the social hierarchy exists, and for those who want to believe that it's a meritocracy when it actually isn't. And, just it kind of validates it. And then it also pumps people with high IQs, or who think they have high IQs. It also pumps up their ego, and they can feel like, they've, they're at a higher position than other people. And so, it's a very elitist worldview. Now, the thing is that there are levels of consciousness. So there is a hierarchy. There is a spiritual hierarchy. It's just not the one that the Darwinist is creating. And the spiritual hierarchy isn't about elitism, because we all eventually return to the all. So, you know what I mean? So it's not like one person might be in the beginning of the journey, one person might be, a different point in their journey. We're all at different phases in the journey, but we all cyclically go through this, once you understand spirituality. So there is no elitism. You lose that baggage, and then now it just becomes about helping people that were in a worldview that you were once stuck in, and trying to help them get out of that. So Dr. Ogden, I never took his class, but I was, walking one day in the campus, and we brushed shoulders, and he was like pointing at a tree and telling me about the tree and its category and this guy, he had a brain for facts, and that's definitely my weakness. So I always admire, people, and usually it's men that have that ability. And so, he's relating this tree to other trees and whatever, and he kind of has this wonder in his eye, and to him that was his mysticism, is just being able to intellectually categorize everything. And ultimately, Mr. Ogden committed suicide, and in a pretty brutal way. And everyone was very, very shocked, including my ex-boyfriend at the time, who had taken his class and was also very influenced by him. And it really, made him and my older brother kind of think about, Dr. Ogden's worldview, although they never really snapped out of the materialist paradigm to my knowing. But for me, I really realized that is where the materialist worldview leads. It leads to death. It's a suicidal worldview, because no good can come from it. It's like all of the other materialist paradigms that relate to it. There's no truth. There's no consciousness. There's no free will. There's no evolution. It's just everything is, atoms and solid material, particles. And so, yeah, that paradigm is it's poison. And I think in this story with Dr. Ogden, it reveals that, even though one can say, oh, he could have had other things going on in his life that made him do that, well, that's true. And, let's look at the worldview of a person who commits suicide. Their worldview is usually self-loathing. If they didn't have a self-loathing worldview and they had bad stuff going on in their lives, they would work through it. They would have the strength and will to do that, understanding that the fundamental nature of the universe is goodness. So that's why I feel like this is a legitimate connection between his death and his worldview, and I just wanted to share that. So take care. All right, see you guys later. Bye.